You're just a mom, Sarah. What could you possibly know about running a business? Those words still echo in my mind, even now, 3 years later, as I sit in the mahogany-paneled boardroom where my husband once dismissed my ideas with a wave of his hand. The same room where, just last month, 11 board members raised their hands to vote me in as majority shareholder of Henderson Defense Solutions, the military contracting company I helped build from the ground up, even though my name was never on the incorporation papers. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start in a boardroom. It starts in a cramped military base housing unit in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I was juggling a screaming 6-month-old, trying to nurse our newborn twins, while my husband Marcus paced the small living room, his phone pressed to his ear, talking numbers and contracts with his business partner. I was 28 then, a former Army logistics specialist who'd left active duty when our first child was born. Marcus liked to introduce me as my wife, the stay-at-home mom. But what he never mentioned was that I'd spent 4 years coordinating million-dollar supply chains, managing inventory systems across 3 continents, and troubleshooting logistics nightmares that would make a Fortune 500 CEO sweat. The Army had trained me to think 10 steps ahead, to anticipate problems before they became disasters, and to move resources efficiently under impossible deadlines. None of that seemed to matter once I traded my uniform for yoga pants and spit-up, stained t-shirts. Marcus had started Henderson Defense Solutions with his Army buddy Jake right after we got married. They'd identified a gap in the market for specialized tactical equipment, gear that was lighter, more durable, and designed specifically for the unique challenges our troops faced in desert environments. It was a good idea, but like most good ideas, execution was everything. I remember the night everything changed. Marcus came home from a meeting with potential investors, his face flushed with excitement and frustration in equal measure. "We were so close, Sarah, so damn close. But they kept asking about our supply chain management, our inventory systems, our logistics infrastructure. Jake and I, we're product guys. We know what soldiers need, but all this back-end stuff." He slumped into our second-hand recliner, running his hands through his hair. I was folding tiny onesies at the kitchen table, half listening while keeping one eye on our toddler who was attempting to feed Cheerios to our German Shepherd. "What specifically did they want to know?" I asked, not looking up from the laundry. "Everything. How we'd handle procurement, distribution, quality control across multiple vendors, inventory turnover rates, just-in-time delivery systems for government contracts. They want to see detailed logistics plans before they'll even consider funding us." That's when I set down the baby clothes and really looked at my husband. "Marcus, I managed logistics for a forward operating base that supplied 15,000 personnel across 12 remote locations. I know supply chain management." He gave me that look, the one I'd grown accustomed to over the past year. Patient, but slightly condescending. "That's different, honey. This is business. This is private sector. It's more complex." I bit back my response, which would have been to remind him that keeping soldiers alive and supplied in active combat zones was probably a bit more complex than shipping tactical gear to stateside military bases. Instead, I picked up another onesie and kept folding. But that night, after Marcus fell asleep, I found myself at our computer, pulling up the business plan he'd left open. What I saw made my stomach drop. Their logistics section was 3 paragraphs of generic corporate speak that said absolutely nothing. Their supply chain strategy was essentially find vendors and buy stuff from them. Their inventory management plan was non-existent. These were good men with a great product idea and zero understanding of the infrastructure needed to scale their business. They were about to walk into another investor meeting and get laughed out of the room. I spent the next 2 weeks, during nap time and after bedtime, completely rewriting their logistics framework. I created detailed vendor evaluation matrices, developed inventory forecasting models, designed quality control protocols, and mapped out distribution networks that would allow them to fulfill government contracts efficiently and profitably. I built them a logistics infrastructure that could scale from their current kitchen table operation to a multi-million-dollar enterprise. When I presented it to Marcus, his eyes went wide. Not with gratitude or recognition, but with surprise. Where did you learn all this? The Army, I said simply. This is what I did every day for 4 years. He stared at the documents for a long time, flipping through pages of charts, graphs, and operational frameworks. Finally, he looked up at me. This is incredible, Sarah. Really. But for the business to work, we need this to be official. Professional. The investors need to see that we have experienced leadership. Okay, I said, assuming he meant we should update his and Jake's bios to reflect their military experience. I'm thinking we should bring in a consultant, someone with an MBA, maybe from one of the big firms, someone the investors will take seriously. I felt something cold settle in my chest. A consultant to do what? To present this work, to be our chief operating officer, to handle the logistics side of the business. The work I just did. Well, yes, but Sarah, you have to understand how this looks. He gestured vaguely at me, at our living room with toys scattered across the floor, at the baby monitor crackling with static. You're a mom, a stay-at-home mom. Investors need to see credentials, experience, gravitas. That was the first time. He said it, though not the last. You're just a mom. I felt my face flush, felt that familiar military bearing straighten my spine. I'm a veteran with 4 years of logistics experience who just solved your company's biggest problem. And I'm grateful, I really am. But honey, be realistic. This is a multi-million-dollar business we're trying to build. These investors, these contracts, they're not going to take orders from someone whose last job was changing diapers. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind him that my last job was ensuring that American soldiers had the equipment they needed to come home alive. I wanted to tell him that managing the logistics for 3 kids under 3 while supporting his dream was harder than anything I'd faced in the military. I wanted to point out that I'd just handed him the key to unlocking millions in funding. Instead, I nodded. Because I loved him. Because I believed in his dream. Because I thought that maybe, once the business got off the ground, he'd see my value and bring me in officially. Marcus hired David Chen, a former McKinsey consultant with an MBA from Wharton, to be their chief operating officer. David took my logistics framework, polished the language, added some buzzwords, and presented it to investors as his own strategic vision. Within 6 months, Henderson Defense Solutions had secured $2.3 million in seed funding. I watched from the sidelines as my husband and his partners celebrated their success, as they moved into real office space, as they hired employees and started fulfilling their first government contracts. Every system they used, every process they followed, every protocol that made their operation run smoothly, I had designed it all. But my name wasn't on any of it. According to the paperwork, according to the corporate structure, according to everyone who mattered, I was just Marcus Henderson's wife, just a mom who sometimes helped out with administrative tasks. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been watching, learning, planning, and I'd discovered something interesting buried in the incorporation documents. Something David Chen's fancy MBA had apparently missed. The military had taught me patience, strategic thinking, and the importance of the long game. It had also taught me that battles aren't always won by the strongest or the loudest, but by the most prepared, and I was very, very prepared. Part 2. Character Introduction. My name is Sarah Catherine Martinez-Henderson, though most people only know the Henderson part now. I grew up in a small town called Millfield in rural Oklahoma, where my father ran an auto repair shop and my mother worked double shifts at the local diner to make ends meet. We weren't poor, but we weren't rich either. We were that particular brand of working class where every dollar was accounted for, and every decision was weighed against practical necessity. I was the middle child of three, sandwiched between my older brother Danny, who could fix anything with an engine, and my younger sister Maria, who had a gift for numbers that would eventually land her a scholarship to Oklahoma State. Me? I was the organizer, the planner, the one who figured out how to make things work when they shouldn't. When I was 12, my father's shop was struggling to keep up with larger chain stores moving into the area. Parts orders were getting mixed up, customer appointments were double booked, and inventory was scattered across 3 different suppliers with no system to track what was coming or going. I spent that entire summer creating filing systems, building appointment schedules, and developing a simple inventory tracking method using index cards and colored tabs that my father still uses to this day. "You've got a mind for logistics, mija," my father told me one evening as we closed up the shop together. "You see the big picture and all the little pieces that make it work." That comment planted a seed that would eventually grow into my military career. I'd always been drawn to puzzles, to systems, to finding efficient ways to move pieces around a complex board. When the Army recruiter came to our high school during my senior year talking about military occupational specialties and career opportunities, the logistics field caught my attention immediately. My parents were supportive but worried. This was 2010, and we were still deep in conflicts overseas. My mother cried when I signed my enlistment papers, but she also hugged me tight and whispered, "Make us proud, mija. You're going to do great things." Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was everything I expected and nothing like I'd prepared for. The physical demands were intense, but the mental challenges were what really pushed me. Learning to think quickly under pressure, to make decisions with incomplete information, to coordinate with team members who came from completely different backgrounds and experiences. It was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool I didn't know existed. But I thrived. I discovered I had a natural aptitude for seeing how different systems interconnected, for anticipating bottlenecks before they occurred, for finding creative solutions when standard procedures weren't working. My drill sergeants noticed, and by the end of basic training, I was being recommended for advanced individual training in logistics and supply chain management. Fort Lee, Virginia became my second home for the next 4 months as I learned the intricacies of military supply systems. We studied everything from requisition procedures to transportation modes, from inventory management to vendor relations. But the real education came during field exercises, when we had to coordinate the movement of personnel, equipment, and supplies under simulated combat conditions. I remember one particular exercise where our unit was tasked with establishing a forward supply depot in a hostile environment within 48 hours. Half the expected equipment hadn't arrived, our primary transportation route had been compromised, and we were operating with a skeleton crew due to simulated casualties. Most of my classmates were panicking, trying to follow standard operating procedures that clearly weren't designed for our current situation. Instead, I started making phone calls. I tracked down the missing equipment at a depot 2 states over and arranged emergency transportation. I found an alternate route that would take longer but was more secure. I reorganized our available personnel to maximize efficiency, cross-training people on multiple systems so we could adapt to further complications. We not only met our deadline, we beat it by 6 hours and came in 15% under budget. My first assignment was Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division's Logistics Support Battalion. This was the big leagues, a rapid deployment unit that could be wheels up anywhere in the world within 18 hours of receiving orders. The margin for error in our supply systems was essentially 0. For the next 2 years, I managed supply chains that stretched across multiple continents, coordinated with vendors in dozens of countries, and solved logistical puzzles that would make civilian supply chain managers lose sleep. When Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast in 2012, our unit was deployed to provide disaster relief, and I found myself coordinating the distribution of emergency supplies to refugee centers across 3 states while simultaneously maintaining our readiness for potential overseas deployment. It was during this assignment that I met Marcus. He was a sergeant in one of the infantry units we supported, and he had a habit of stopping by our supply depot to chat with whoever was working the night shift. Most of the time, that was me. Marcus was different from the other soldiers I'd encountered. He was thoughtful, ambitious, and genuinely interested in how things worked rather than just complaining when they didn't. He'd ask questions about our procurement processes, about how we managed inventory across multiple locations, about the challenges of coordinating with civilian contractors. "You make this look easy," he told me one night as I juggled 3 different supply requests while troubleshooting a transportation delay. "But I know it's not." "Nothing worthwhile is easy," I replied, not looking up from my computer screen. "But that doesn't mean it has to be impossible." We started dating 6 months later. Marcus was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: stable, driven, respectful of my career and ambitions. When he talked about his post-military plans, about starting a business that would serve other veterans, I was genuinely excited to be part of that vision. He made me feel like we were building something together. My 3rd year at Bragg, I was promoted to staff sergeant and given responsibility for coordinating logistics across multiple forward operating bases. This meant managing supply chains for over 15,000 personnel spread across hostile territory, working with local contractors who didn't always speak English, and adapting to rapidly changing security situations that could cut off entire supply routes with no warning. The work was intense, but I loved it. Every day brought new challenges that required creative problem-solving and strategic thinking. I was managing million-dollar budgets, coordinating with suppliers across 4 time zones, and making decisions that directly impacted soldier safety and mission success. I was also planning a wedding. Marcus had proposed during his leave the previous Christmas, and we'd set a date for the following summer. The plan was for both of us to complete our current enlistments and then transition to civilian life together. He'd been accepted to a business program that would help veterans start their own companies, and I was looking at supply chain management positions with several large corporations. Everything changed when I found out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwelcome either. Marcus and I had talked about wanting children eventually, and while the timing wasn't perfect, we were both committed to making it work. The problem was that my current assignment involved potential deployment to active combat zones, which wasn't compatible with pregnancy. My commanding officer was understanding but clear about my options. I could request transfer to a stateside position with limited advancement opportunities, or I could accept early discharge and focus on starting my family. Marcus was pushing for the discharge option, arguing that it made more sense for me to be home with the baby while he established his business. "You can always go back to work later," he said. "But right now, we need to think about what's best for our family." Looking back, I can see that this was the first crack in the foundation of our partnership. Marcus had somehow shifted from "we're building something together" to "I'm building something and you're supporting me." But at the time, I was 26 years old, pregnant, and in love. I trusted that he saw my value, that he understood what I was capable of, and that once his business was established, there would be room for my skills and ambitions too. Accepted the early discharge and transitioned to civilian life, just as Marcus was starting Henderson Defense Solutions with his Army buddy Jake. The plan was for me to handle the administrative side of the business while Marcus and Jake focused on product development and sales. I would be the behind-the-scenes partner who kept everything running smoothly. Our son David was born 3 months after Marcus's company was incorporated. 2 years later, we had twin daughters, Emma and Sophie. By the time the twins were walking, Henderson Defense Solutions had grown from a kitchen table operation to a company with 12 employees and over $3 million in annual revenue. And I was invisible. Every system that made their operation run efficiently, I had designed. Every vendor relationship that saved them money, I had cultivated. Every process that allowed them to scale rapidly without losing quality control, I had developed. But according to every official document, every business card, every introduction, at networking events, I was simply Marcus Henderson's wife, the woman who sometimes helped out with paperwork. Just a mom. Part 3. The challenge problem. The first real crack in my carefully constructed world appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years after Henderson Defense Solutions had become what Marcus liked to call a legitimate operation. I was in the kitchen, simultaneously packing lunchboxes for the kids, reviewing a vendor proposal that had landed in my personal email, and trying to convince 3-year-old Emma that wearing pants to preschool was non-negotiable. Marcus burst through the front door, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like panic. "Sarah, we need to talk. Now." I glanced at the clock. School drop-off was in 20 minutes, and I had a conference call with a potential new supplier at 9. "Can it wait until—" "No, it can't wait." He grabbed my arm, not roughly, but with an urgency that made Emma look up from her ongoing pants rebellion. "This is big. This could change everything." After depositing the kids at school and daycare, I found Marcus in his home office, surrounded by papers and wearing the same expression he'd had the day he learned his unit was deploying to Afghanistan. Jake was there too, looking equally shell-shocked. Pentagon. "Contract," Marcus said without preamble. "Specialized tactical gear for Special Operations Command, 18-month exclusive deal worth $47 million. I felt my eyebrows shoot up. That's incredible. Congratulations." "There's a catch," Jake interjected. "Multiple catches, actually." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit I'd learned to recognize over our 7 years of marriage. "They want to award the contract, but they need assurance that we can scale production by 400% within 6 months while maintaining current quality standards. They want detailed logistics plans, supply chain redundancies, quality control protocols, and evidence that we can manage inventory and distribution for an operation 15 times larger than anything we've handled before." "Okay," I said slowly. "That's challenging, but not impossible. You have good systems in place already." "Systems you built," Jake said quietly. Marcus shot him a look. "The problem is presentation," Marcus continued. "The review board is made up of generals, defense contractors, Pentagon procurement officials. They're going to want to see that we have senior leadership with the credentials and experience to manage this kind of expansion." I felt that familiar cold sensation settling in my stomach. "And?" "David Chen is good, but he's been with us less than 2 years. His experience is mostly in civilian consulting. The board is going to want to see military logistics experience, someone who understands government contracting from the inside, who's managed supply chains under pressure." I stared at my husband, waiting for him to say the obvious thing. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed me a LinkedIn profile. Colonel James Morrison, retired. 30 years in Army logistics, including 5 years as Deputy Commander of the Defense Logistics Agency. MBA from Georgetown, currently consulting for 3 other defense contractors. "You want to hire him?" I said. It wasn't a question. We need to hire him. As Senior Vice President of Operations, he'd oversee all logistics, supply chain management, and operational scaling. The board would take one look at his credentials and approve the contract immediately. Jake was studying his shoes. Marcus was watching my face carefully, as if trying to gauge my reaction to what he clearly thought was good news. "Marcus," I said slowly, "I designed every logistics system your company uses. I developed your vendor relationships, your quality control protocols, your inventory management processes. I've been managing your supply chain expansion for 3 years. I know government contracting because I worked in government contracting. I understand military logistics because I am a military logistics specialist." "Were," Marcus corrected gently. You were a military logistics specialist. That was almost 6 years ago. The knowledge doesn't expire. The skills don't disappear, because I've been raising children. I know that, and you know that, but the Pentagon doesn't know that. They're going to see a stay-at-home mom who helps out with administrative tasks, not a qualified senior executive. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire. That was just beginning to catch. So let me understand this correctly, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You want to hire someone to come in and manage the systems I built, using the processes I developed, to win a contract that you can only fulfill because of the infrastructure I created. And you want to pay him probably 3 times what we pay our current highest salary employee to do the job I've been doing for free for 3 years. Sarah, that's not fair. This isn't about the money, isn't it? Because Colonel Morrison isn't going to work for free. He's going to want equity, probably a significant equity stake in a company that wouldn't exist without my work. Marcus's face was turning red, which usually meant he was about to say something he'd regret. Your work? Sarah, I appreciate everything you've done. I really do. But let's be realistic here. You've helped out, yes. But Jake and I built this company. We took the risks. We made the sacrifices. We put our names and our reputations on the line. What exactly do you think I've been doing for the past 3 years? You've been raising our children, he said, as if that settled the matter. Which is important, incredibly important, but it's not the same as building a business. I felt something snap inside me, like a cable that had been under tension for too long. I've been raising our children and building your business. I've been managing vendor relationships during playdates, reviewing contracts during nap time, troubleshooting supply chain issues at 2 a.m. when the twins were teething. I've been doing the work of a senior executive while pretending to be just your helpful wife. And I'm grateful. Are you? Because gratitude would look like recognition. Gratitude would look like putting my name on the work I do. Gratitude would look like giving me an official position instead of hiring someone else to take credit for my systems. Jake cleared his throat uncomfortably. Maybe I should leave you two to discuss this privately. No, I said firmly. Stay. Because this affects the company, and you're a partner in the company, so you should hear this. I turned back to Marcus, and for the first time in our marriage, I let him see exactly how angry I was. You want to know what's really unfair? What's unfair is that I have twice the relevant experience of anyone you're considering hiring, but because I've spent the last 3 years supporting your dreams instead of building my own resume, you think I'm not qualified to do the job I've already been doing. The Pentagon isn't going to. You don't know what the Pentagon is going to do, because you've never tried. You've never put my name forward, never suggested that the woman who actually runs your logistics operations might be capable of representing your logistics operations. Marcus stood up, pacing to the window. Sarah, be reasonable. This contract could set us up for life. All of us. It could mean college funds for the kids, financial security for our family, the ability to grow this company into something really significant. We can't risk losing it because we want to make a political statement. A political statement? I repeated. You think giving me credit for my own work is a political statement? I think putting forward someone with no official business experience, no advanced degree, no current professional credentials, to manage a $47 million government contract would be problematic. There it was. The thing he'd been dancing around for 3 years, finally said out loud. In Marcus's mind, I wasn't a veteran with 4 years of military logistics experience who had designed and managed every operational system his company used. I was just a mom who helped out sometimes and had delusions of professional competence. So, that's it then, I said quietly. You're going to hire Colonel Morrison. I think it's the smart move. And what happens to me? Do I keep doing the actual work while he takes credit for it? Do I become his unpaid assistant? Or do you just not need my help anymore now that you have a real professional? Marcus looked genuinely confused, as if the question had never occurred to him. "You're my wife, Sarah. You're the mother of my children. Your role in this family and my life is more important than any job title." That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Sarah, you're not just a mom. You're our mom. You're the foundation that makes everything else possible. That's more valuable than any corporate position. Jake was looking increasingly uncomfortable, but I barely noticed. All of my attention was focused on my husband, who genuinely seemed to believe that what he was saying was reasonable, even flattering. "Marcus," I said slowly, "do you respect my professional abilities?" "Of course I do. Do you believe I'm capable of managing large-scale logistics operations?" "Absolutely. Do you think I could successfully represent our company to Pentagon officials?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. "I think," he said carefully, "that there are appearances to consider. Perceptions matter in business. And the perception of me is what, exactly?" Another hesitation. "You're a wonderful mother and wife who helps out with the business. Not a logistics expert, not a veteran, not a professional, just a mom who helps out." That night, after Marcus had gone to bed, I sat in our kitchen with my laptop, looking at the Henderson Defense Solutions corporate structure for the first time in months. What I found there made my blood run cold. Over the past year, Marcus and Jake had been restructuring the company ownership. David Chen now held 15% equity. 2 other employees had been granted small stakes. An investor group had taken a 20% share in exchange for expansion capital. My name appeared nowhere on any of the documents. According to every legal record, I had no stake in the company I'd helped build, no claim to the systems I'd designed, no rights to the business I'd been managing for 3 years. If Marcus decided he didn't need my help anymore, if he wanted to bring in Colonel Morrison and push me out entirely, I had no legal recourse whatsoever. I was a ghost in my own professional life, a phantom partner with no power and no protection. But as I scrolled through the documents, I found something interesting. Something that Marcus, in his eagerness to bring in investors and grant equity to employees, had apparently overlooked. The original incorporation papers were still on file, unchanged since the company's founding, and buried in the standard legal. Language was a clause that neither Marcus nor his lawyer had bothered to modify when they started restructuring ownership, a clause that might change everything. Part 4. Initial Struggle. The clause. I discovered that Knight was buried on page 7 of the original incorporation documents, in a section titled Spousal Rights and Community Property Provisions. It was standard boilerplate language that most lawyers include automatically, especially when married couples are involved in business formation. What made it significant was that Marcus had never bothered to modify it when he started restructuring the company. The clause essentially stated that any spouse who contributed substantial intellectual property, operational expertise, or ongoing management services to the company during its development phase was entitled to equitable consideration in ownership discussions. It was vague enough to be almost meaningless, but specific enough to potentially give me legal standing. The problem was proving my contributions. Marcus had been careful, probably unconsciously, to keep my involvement unofficial. My emails about vendor negotiations came from my personal account. My logistics plans and operational improvements were saved on my home computer. The conference calls I'd participated in were always introduced as "Sarah's joining us to help out," never as "Sarah, our logistics manager, will now present her recommendations." I had been complicit in my own invisibility. The next morning, I started documenting everything. While Marcus was at the office and the kids were at school, I began methodically going through 3 years of emails, files, and records. I printed vendor contracts that I had negotiated, saved copies of logistics frameworks I had designed, and compiled evidence of my ongoing operational involvement. What I found shocked me. I had underestimated my own contributions. I wasn't just helping out occasionally. I was essentially functioning as the company's unpaid chief operating officer. I had negotiated 70% of their vendor relationships, designed their entire inventory management system, developed their quality control protocols, and solved countless operational crises that Marcus and Jake never even knew were crises, because I'd handled them before they became problems. The Pentagon contract proposal was due in 6 weeks. Marcus had already reached out to Colonel Morrison, who was interested but demanding a $180,000 salary plus 8% equity stake. David Chen was scrambling to prepare presentation materials that would demonstrate the company's operational capabilities that existed because of systems I had built. I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to fight for recognition, officially and publicly. My first attempt was direct conversation. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I presented Marcus with a comprehensive portfolio of my contributions to the company. I had organized it like a professional presentation with clear metrics, documented results, and evidence of my ongoing operational involvement. "This is impressive," Marcus said, flipping through the pages. "Really, Sarah? I had no idea you'd been keeping such detailed records." "It's not just records, Marcus. It's proof of my role in this company. Look at the vendor negotiations alone. I've saved you over $400,000 in the past 2 years by renegotiating contracts and finding better suppliers." He nodded, still reading. "This is great documentation for our Pentagon proposal. It shows that we have sophisticated operational systems in place." "That's not the point," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "The point is that I built these systems. I should be the one presenting them." Marcus set down the portfolio and looked at me with what I was beginning to recognize as his managing the wife expression. "Sarah, we've been through this. The Pentagon. Presentation is too important to take risks." "What risk? I know these systems better than anyone. I designed them." "The risk is that they won't take you seriously, that they'll see a housewife playing businesswoman instead of a seasoned professional." That word, housewife, hit me like a slap. I'm a veteran, Marcus. I have 4 years of military logistics experience and 3 years of hands-on experience running your operations. How is that less qualified than Colonel Morrison, who hasn't worked in active logistics in 5 years? He has credibility, recognition, a reputation in the defense contracting community. Built on what? His military rank? Because my military experience apparently doesn't count? Marcus sighed, the sound of a man who thought he was being very patient with an unreasonable woman. "Sarah, it's not about your qualifications. It's about perception. It's about what the Pentagon officials will see when they look across the table." "And what they'll see when they look at me is what, exactly?" Another hesitation. Another moment where my husband's respect for my professional abilities crumbled under scrutiny. "They'll see someone who doesn't fit their expectations of a senior executive." There, it was again. The same message, delivered with slightly different words. I wasn't the right kind of person to represent the company I'd helped build. My second attempt was going through Jake. He had always been more receptive to my input, more willing to acknowledge my contributions. I cornered him at the office the next day during lunch when Marcus was meeting with potential investors. "Jake, we need to talk about the Pentagon contract." He looked uncomfortable immediately. "Sarah, if this is about the Colonel Morrison thing, I think you should discuss it with Marcus. I'm discussing it with you because you're a partner in this company, and this affects the company's future." I laid out the same argument I'd made to Marcus, with the same documentation and evidence. Jake listened carefully, nodding at appropriate moments. "You're right," he said finally. "You absolutely deserve recognition for your work. You've been essential to our success." My heart lifted. Finally, Someone was seeing reason. But, I prompted, because I could hear the but coming. But, this contract is make or break for us, Sarah. If we don't get it, we might not survive as a company. The competition is brutal, and we need every advantage we can get. I am an advantage. I'm the person who actually knows how our systems work. I know that. Marcus knows that. But will the Pentagon know that? Will they be impressed by your credentials? Or will they be distracted by other factors? Other factors. Another euphemism for the same underlying message. Jake, do you think I'm professionally competent? Absolutely. Do you think I could handle the operational responsibilities of this contract? Without question. Then why won't you support me being officially recognized for the work I'm already doing? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup. Because I'm scared, he said finally. This company is my entire financial future. My kids' college funds, my retirement, my wife's security, it's all tied up in Henderson Defense Solutions. I can't afford to take risks with something this important. At least Jake was being honest. He saw me as a risk, not because of my qualifications, but because of how others might perceive those qualifications. In his mind, my gender and my status as a stay-at-home mom made me a liability, regardless of my actual abilities. My third attempt was the most desperate and, in retrospect, the most naive. I decided to approach David Chen directly. As the current chief operating officer, he would be working closely with whoever managed the Pentagon contract expansion. I thought he might be willing to advocate for promoting me to an official position rather than bringing in an outside hire. David was polite but dismissive. Sarah, I appreciate all the work you've done for the company. Your contributions have been valuable. But operations management at this level requires specific credentials and experience that might be difficult to establish given your current background. My current background includes designing every system you're currently using. Yes, but informally. The Pentagon is going to want to see formal business education, official, management experience, professional certifications. They're going to want someone whose qualifications they can verify through traditional channels. They can verify my military experience. Of course, but that was several years ago, and it wasn't in a senior leadership capacity. You were enlisted, not an officer. You weren't making strategic decisions or managing large-scale operations. This was factually incorrect. I had managed large-scale operations, but I could see that David had already made up his mind about what my military experience did and didn't qualify me for. So, you think bringing in Colonel Morrison is the right choice? I think it's the safe choice. And sometimes safe is more important than ideal. That word again. Safe. Everyone kept talking about the safe choice, as if giving me official recognition for my own work was some kind of dangerous gamble. By the fourth week, I was becoming desperate. The Pentagon proposal deadline was approaching, and Marcus had officially extended an offer to Colonel Morrison. I had been relegated to consultant status. They wanted me to continue doing the actual work of preparing operational plans and logistics frameworks, but Colonel Morrison would be the one presenting them and taking credit for them. I felt like I was disappearing, becoming more invisible with each passing day. The systems I had built were being attributed to other people. The work I was doing was being presented as support rather than leadership. My professional identity was being systematically erased. The breaking point came during a strategy meeting that I wasn't invited to attend. I only learned about it when I arrived at the office to drop off some revised vendor contracts and heard Marcus, Jake, David, and Colonel Morrison discussing the Pentagon presentation through the closed conference room door. The logistics framework is solid, Colonel Morrison was saying. Whoever put this together knows what they're doing. That would be my wife, Marcus replied. She's been helping out with operational stuff. Helping out. 3 years of professional-level work reduced to helping out. Well, she's done good work, the colonel continued. I'll need to review everything in detail, maybe make some adjustments to bring it up to Pentagon standards. But the foundation is solid. My work needed to be brought up to Pentagon standards. The systems I had designed using my Pentagon experience needed to be improved by someone whose Pentagon experience was a decade old. Sarah's been invaluable, Jake added. She'll continue to support the operational side once you're on board. Support. Not lead, not manage, not direct. Support. I stood outside that conference room door, listening to 4 men discuss how to divvy up credit for my work, and I realized that nothing I could say or do was going to change their fundamental perception of me. I could present all the evidence in the world, but they had already decided that I was not the kind of person who could officially represent their company. They saw me as Marcus-Henderson's helpful wife, and no amount of documentation or argument was going to transform me into Sarah Martinez-Henderson, accomplished logistics professional. But standing there, listening to them plan my continued invisibility, I remembered something important. Something I had learned in the military, and then forgotten in my eagerness to be a supportive spouse. Sometimes you can't change people's minds through conversation or persuasion. Sometimes you have to change the situation itself. That night, I called my sister Maria, the one who had gotten the scholarship to Oklahoma State and now worked as a forensic accountant in Dallas. Maria, I said, I need help with something complicated, and I need you to keep it completely confidential. What's going on, Sarah? I need to know everything there is to know about corporate law, shareholder rights, and spousal property claims. And I need to know it fast. There was a pause. Are you and Marcus having problems? Marcus and I are fine, I said. But Marcus and I might be having some very serious business disagreements soon. Part 5. The turning point, Maria arrived from Dallas on a Friday afternoon, her BMW loaded with legal textbooks, printed case studies, and 3 different laptops. My sister had always been the family's analytical mind, the one who could dissect complex problems and find solutions that others missed. Seeing her walk into my kitchen with the focused intensity of a forensic accountant on a mission gave me the first real hope I'd felt in weeks. Show me everything, she said without preamble, setting up what looked like a mobile law office on my dining room table. Corporate documents, incorporation papers, partnership agreements, financial records, communications, everything. For the Next 4 hours, while the kids played in the backyard and Marcus worked late at the office, Maria and I went through 3 years of Henderson Defense Solutions corporate history with surgical precision. She asked questions I hadn't thought to ask, identified patterns I hadn't noticed, and found inconsistencies that made her whistle low under her breath. Sarah, she said finally, leaning back in her chair, this is either the most amateurish corporate structure I've ever seen, or your husband has been phenomenally careless with legal documentation. What do you mean? She pulled out the original incorporation papers and pointed to several sections. Look at this. When Marcus and Jake first incorporated, they filed as an LLC with community property considerations because you were married in Texas, which is a community property state. But when they started bringing in investors and restructuring ownership, they never properly addressed the spousal property implications. I don't understand. Under Texas community property law, any business started during a marriage using marital assets, time, money, intellectual property, or labor is potentially considered community property, meaning both spouses have legal claims to it. The fact that you've been actively involved in the business operations for 3 years and that your contributions can be documented strengthens that claim significantly. I felt my pulse quicken. So I do have legal rights to the company? Potentially. Yes, but it's complicated. Maria pulled up several case studies on her laptop. There have been similar situations where non-titled spouses successfully claimed ownership stakes based on substantial contributions to business development. But these cases typically involve divorce proceedings, not active marriages where one spouse is trying to claim recognition within an ongoing business relationship. So, what are my options? Maria was quiet for several minutes, reading through legal precedents and making notes. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I remembered from our childhood, the look she got when she'd figured out how to solve a puzzle that everyone else thought was impossible. "You have 3 potential paths," she said. "The first is continued negotiation and documentation of your contributions, hoping Marcus eventually recognizes your value and gives you official status voluntarily. We both know that's not going to happen." "Right. The second option is to threaten legal action to establish your community property rights to the business. That would probably result in a financial settlement and recognition of your contributions. But it would also likely destroy your marriage and split the company." I felt my stomach clench. "And the third option?" "The third option is the most interesting, and it's why your husband's sloppy corporate documentation might actually work in your favor." She pulled out a different set of papers. When Henderson Defense Solutions brought in that investor group, last year, they restructured as a C corporation to accommodate the new investment. But they never properly addressed the pre-existing LLC structure or the community property implications. What does that mean in practical terms? It means there's a legal argument that the conversion from LLC to C Corp was incomplete, particularly regarding spousal community property rights. If that argument holds up, you could potentially claim that you're entitled to recognition as a founding member of the original LLC, which would give you significant rights in the current corporate structure. My head was spinning. But wouldn't that still require legal action? Wouldn't that still destroy my marriage? Maria smiled, and it was not a particularly nice smile. "Not necessarily. Corporate law allows for internal challenges to ownership. Structure, especially when there are questions about proper filing procedures. You could petition the board of directors, which currently consists of Marcus, Jake, and David Chen, to recognize your founding member status and grant you appropriate equity and authority." They would never agree to that. They might, if the alternative is a legal challenge that could invalidate their entire corporate structure and scare off the Pentagon contract. I stared at my sister, beginning to understand the scope of what she was suggesting. "You're talking about corporate warfare. I'm talking about using the law to claim what's rightfully yours. The question is whether you're prepared to do that." Over the weekend, while Marcus spent Saturday at the office preparing for the Pentagon presentation and Sunday playing golf with potential investors, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. I was going to fight for my place in the company I'd helped build, using every legal tool at my disposal. Maria helped me prepare a comprehensive legal brief documenting my community property claims and my contributions to the company's development. We gathered evidence of my ongoing operational involvement, financial contributions through unpaid labor, and intellectual property development. The document was 43 pages long and read like a corporate espionage report, but the legal brief was just the foundation. Maria's real insight was understanding that this wasn't just about law, it was about leverage and timing. "The Pentagon contract review is in 10 days, she pointed out. "Marcus can't afford any disruption to the company structure right now. If you present your claims at the right moment, with the right framing, you can force a negotiation rather than a confrontation." "What kind of negotiation?" "Official recognition of your role, appropriate equity stake, and formal authority over the operational areas you've been managing. In exchange, you provide stability and continuity for the Pentagon." Presentation. It sounded too good to be true. "And if they refuse? Then you file your community property claim and request an injunction to prevent any major corporate decisions, including the Pentagon contract award, until the ownership issues are resolved." The beauty of the strategy was its timing. Marcus needed corporate stability to win the Pentagon contract, but he also needed the Pentagon contract to maintain corporate viability. I was offering him both, in exchange for what I'd been trying to get through negotiation for months. On Monday morning, I requested a formal meeting with the board of directors. Marcus was surprised but not suspicious. I'd attended board meetings before in my unofficial capacity. What's this about, Sarah? He asked as we gathered in the conference room. It's about formalizing my role in the company, I said calmly. I have some proposals I'd like the board to consider. Jake and David exchanged glances. They probably thought I was going to make another emotional appeal for recognition. Instead, I distributed copies of Maria's legal brief. What's this? David asked, flipping through the pages. It's a legal analysis of my community property rights in Henderson Defense Solutions, along with documentation of my contributions to the company's development and current operations. The room went very quiet as they read. I watched Marcus's face go through several expressions: confusion, surprise, understanding, and finally, anger. Sarah, what the hell is this? It's exactly what it says it is. A legal assessment of my ownership rights in this company. Jake was reading more carefully, his expression growing increasingly concerned. Sarah, these community property statutes, are these legitimate claims? My sister is a forensic accountant who specializes in corporate litigation. She assures me that the claims are not only legitimate but quite strong, particularly given the documentation of my ongoing contributions. David was now reading the operational documentation, his face pale. You've been tracking everything. Every vendor negotiation, every system implementation, every process improvement. Of course I have. I'm a logistics professional. Documentation is part of the job. Marcus slammed his copy of the brief down on the table. This is blackmail. No, I said calmly. Blackmail would be threatening to expose embarrassing information unless you pay me money. This is a business negotiation based on legal rights and documented contributions. You're threatening to sue your own husband. I'm offering to resolve this issue internally, as a business matter between partners, rather than through external legal action. Jake was still reading, his face growing more worried by the minute. Sarah, if you challenge the corporate structure now, it could affect the Pentagon contract. They specifically require stable ownership and clear operational authority. Exactly, I said, which is why I'm proposing an internal resolution that provides both stability and clarity. What kind of resolution? David asked. I pulled out a second document, one I'd prepared myself. Official recognition as Chief Operating Officer with appropriate salary and equity stake. Formal authority over all logistics, supply chain, and operational systems. And representation rights in major corporate decisions, including the Pentagon contract presentation. Marcus was staring at me as if I'd grown a second head. You want to present to the Pentagon? I want to present the operational frameworks I designed to the Pentagon officials who will be evaluating our operational capabilities. Yes. This is insane, Marcus said. Sarah, they'll laugh us out of the room. Why? Because I'm a woman? Because I'm not wearing a military uniform anymore? Or because you've spent 3 years telling everyone that I'm just your helpful wife? The room was quiet again. Finally, Jake spoke up. What happens if we don't agree to your proposal? I looked at each of them in turn. Then I file my community property claim with the state, request an injunction to prevent major corporate decisions until ownership issues are resolved, and we see how the Pentagon responds to a defense contractor embroiled in internal legal disputes. David was the first to understand the implications. The Pentagon would pull the contract consideration immediately. Any whiff of internal instability or legal complications? Exactly, I said. So we can resolve this as partners, or we can resolve it as adversaries. But we're going to resolve it. Marcus was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, but something that might have been respect, mixed with shock. You've been planning this for weeks. I've been planning this for 3 years, I corrected. I just finally found the right leverage to make it happen. And if we agree to your terms, you'll support the Pentagon presentation? I'll do more than support it. I'll make sure we win it. For the first time in our marriage, Marcus was looking at me as if he were seeing me clearly. Not as his helpful wife, not as the mother of his children, but as a professional adversary who had just outmaneuvered him completely. "We need time to consider this," Jake said. "You have 48 hours, I replied. "After that, I file the legal papers." As I walked out of that conference room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. Part 6. The Journey Process. The 48 hours that followed my ultimatum were the longest of my marriage. Marcus barely spoke to me, spending most of his time either at the office or locked in his home study, presumably consulting with lawyers and trying to figure out how his helpful wife had managed to corner him so completely. The kids sensed the tension but couldn't understand it. They kept asking why Daddy seemed angry and why Mommy was spending so much time on the computer. I used those 2 days to prepare for every possible outcome. If the board accepted my terms, I needed to be ready to step into an official leadership role immediately. If they rejected my proposal, I needed to be prepared for the legal and personal consequences of following through on my threat. Maria had returned to Dallas, but remained on call, ready to file the necessary paperwork the moment I gave her the word. She'd also connected me with Rebecca Torres, a corporate attorney in Houston who specialized in women's business rights and community property disputes. Rebecca was blunt in her assessment. "Your case is strong," she told me during our Tuesday evening phone call. "The documentation is excellent, the community property laws are clear, and the corporate restructuring issues give you multiple legal angles. But you need to understand what you're risking here." "What do you mean?" "If you push this to litigation, you're not just challenging your husband's business decisions, you're potentially destroying the business itself. The Pentagon contract would disappear, investor confidence would evaporate, and you could end up with a 50% stake in a company that's worth nothing. And if I don't push it, then you continue being invisible, continue having your contributions minimized, and watch someone else take credit for your work while building wealth you'll never have legal claim to." It was a stark choice, but it was also clarifying. I had spent 3 years hoping that Marcus would eventually recognize my value. Now I understood that recognition wasn't something I could wait for. It was something I had to demand and, if necessary, fight for. On Wednesday evening, Marcus finally broke his silence. He found me in the kitchen after dinner, cleaning up while the kids watched a movie in the living room. "We need to talk," he said quietly. I dried my hands and turned to face him. "Okay." The board met this afternoon, with our lawyer present. And? Marcus looked older than he had just 2 days earlier, as if the stress of the situation had aged him visibly. "Our lawyer says your legal position is stronger than we expected." I waited. "He also says that pursuing litigation right now would be corporate suicide. The Pentagon has already indicated they're concerned about contractor stability, and any hint of internal legal disputes would end our chances immediately. So what did the board decide?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. When he looked up, his expression was a mixture of resignation and something that might have been admiration. "We're accepting your terms, with modifications." My heart started beating faster. "What kind of modifications?" "Official title of Chief Operating Officer, starting immediately. Salary of $125,000 annually, which is what David makes. Equity stake of 12%, which reflects your documented contributions but maintains the existing investor agreements." It was less equity than I'd hoped for, but more recognition than I'd dared to expect 6 months ago. "And operational authority?" "Full authority over logistics, supply chain management, vendor relations, and operational scaling. You'll report to the board rather than to me or Jake directly." "And the Pentagon presentation?" This was clearly the hardest part for Marcus to accept. "You'll co-present with Colonel Morrison. He'll handle military protocol and strategic overview. You'll present the operational capabilities and implementation plans." I felt a surge of something between victory and vindication. The board agreed to all of this? Jake was actually relieved. He said he'd rather have you as an official partner than as a legal threat. David was less enthusiastic, but he understands the business realities. And you? Marcus was quiet again, studying my face as if trying to understand how the woman he'd married had become someone capable of corporate warfare. "I'm angry," he said finally. "I'm angry that you felt you had to threaten legal action instead of just talking to me. I'm angry that you've been documenting everything like you were building a case against me. I'm angry that you think I don't value your contributions. But I'm also impressed. And maybe a little scared." He managed a rueful smile. "I'm married, a logistics specialist, but I think I've been living with a strategist. The transformation from invisible wife to official executive happened faster than I'd expected. By Friday, I had business cards, an office, and an email signature that read, Sarah Martinez-Henderson, Chief Operating Officer." David Chen was professionally gracious about the change, though I could tell he was uncomfortable with the sudden shift in power dynamics. Jake seemed genuinely relieved to have someone officially responsible for the operational challenges that had been keeping him awake at night. The most difficult adjustment was with Colonel Morrison. He'd been brought in expecting to manage all operational aspects of the Pentagon contract, and now he was being asked to partner with the helpful wife he'd barely acknowledged during previous meetings. Our first working session was awkward. The colonel clearly didn't know how to interact with me in my new official capacity. He kept addressing questions to David or Marcus, even when they involved systems I'd designed. "Colonel," I said finally, after he'd spent 10 minutes asking David about vendor redundancy protocols that I'd developed. "Perhaps it would be more efficient if you directed operational questions to me directly, since I'll be managing those systems." He looked at me with barely concealed skepticism. "Of course, I'm still adjusting to the new arrangement. The arrangement where I'm officially recognized for work I've been doing for 3 years? Yes, that does take some getting used to." There was a long pause. Then, unexpectedly, Colonel Morrison smiled. "You know, I've reviewed your logistics frameworks in detail over the past week. They're some of the most sophisticated operational designs I've seen in the private sector. I was wondering who the hell had put them together." "Now you know." "Now I know." He extended his hand. "I think this partnership might work better than I initially expected." The Pentagon presentation was scheduled for the following Wednesday. That gave us exactly 1 week to coordinate our materials, align our messaging, and prepare for what would essentially be a performance evaluation of Henderson Defense Solutions' capability to manage a $47 million contract. I threw myself into preparation with an intensity that surprised everyone, including myself. This wasn't just about winning a contract. It was about proving that I belonged in that room, that I could represent the company I'd helped build with the same professionalism and expertise as any traditional executive. Maria drove up from Dallas to help me prepare. She'd taken time off work specifically to coach me through the presentation, and her support meant more than I could express. "You know your material better than anyone in that room will," she reminded me as we practiced in my living room. "You built these systems. You understand every detail, every contingency, every strength and weakness. Just remember that confidence comes from competence, and you are absolutely competent." The night before the presentation, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through scenarios, anticipating questions, reviewing details. At 2 a.m., I found myself in the kitchen, going through my notes one more time. Marcus found me there, sitting at the table surrounded by spreadsheets and logistics charts. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Too much adrenaline." He poured himself a glass of water and sat down across from me. "Sarah, I need to say something." I looked up from my notes. "I owe you an apology. Not just for the past few weeks, but for the past 3 years. I've been taking your contributions for granted, and worse than that, I've been actively diminishing them." "Marcus, no, let me finish. I told myself I was protecting you, or protecting the business, but really I was protecting my own ego. It was easier to think of you as my supportive wife than to acknowledge that you might be more professionally capable than I am. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. I just wanted to be seen for who I really am. Not just who I am in relation to you. Tomorrow, they're going to see exactly who you are. And I think they're going to be impressed. Are you ready for that? For other people to see me as a professional equal, not just as your wife? Marcus was quiet for a moment. I'm going to have to be, aren't I? Because that's who you've always been, even when I was too blind to see it. The next morning, I put on my best suit, a navy blue ensemble I'd bought for job interviews years ago but never had occasion to wear, and drove to the Henderson Defense Solutions office to meet Colonel Morrison. We were presenting to a panel of 5 Pentagon officials, including 2 generals, a procurement director, and 2 technical specialists. As we drove to the presentation venue, Colonel Morrison went over our division of responsibilities one final time. I'll handle the opening remarks, company background, and strategic alignment with military objectives. You'll present operational capabilities, scalability plans, and implementation timelines. We'll tag team the Q&A based on question type. Understood. Sarah, he said as we pulled into the parking lot of the government building where the presentation would take place, I want you to know that I've never worked with a more thoroughly prepared co-presenter. Whatever happens in there, you've earned your place at that table. Walking into that building, wearing my official title and carrying materials for systems I'd designed, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving the military. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The conference room was intimidating. Long mahogany table, American flags, portraits of military leaders, and 5 stern-faced officials who held the power to transform our small company into a major defense contractor. But as I began presenting the operational frameworks I'd spent 3 years developing, as I answered detailed questions about supply chain management and logistics coordination, as I demonstrated my understanding of military procurement requirements and contractor responsibilities, I realized something important. I wasn't just fighting for recognition anymore. I was winning it. Part 7. Obstacles and Setbacks. The Pentagon presentation went better than I could have hoped. General Patricia Morrison, no relation to the colonel, asked penetrating questions about our scalability protocols, and I was able to walk her through detailed contingency plans for supply chain disruptions, quality control at increased production volumes, and vendor management across multiple time zones. When Procurement Director James Walsh challenged our delivery timelines, I had ready answers backed by 3 years of performance data. Colonel Morrison and I worked seamlessly together, and by the end of the 90-minute session, I could see grudging respect in the eyes of officials who had initially seemed skeptical about our small company's capabilities. We'll have a decision within 2 weeks, General Morrison told us as we concluded. Your operational frameworks are impressive, and your understanding of military logistics requirements is clearly robust. Walking out of that building, I felt like I was floating. Marcus was waiting in the parking lot, having driven separately, to avoid any appearance of family business mixing with professional matters. How did it go? He asked immediately. I think we nailed it, Colonel Morrison answered before I could speak. Your wife, your chief operating officer, knows her stuff. I've presented to dozens of Pentagon panels, and I've never seen anyone handle technical questions with that level of expertise. Marcus looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure professional admiration. I'm proud of you, he said simply. For exactly 48 hours, everything felt perfect. I had official recognition, professional respect, and what seemed like imminent validation of my capabilities through a major contract win. I started making plans for hiring additional staff, expanding our operational infrastructure, and finally stepping fully into the executive role I'd fought to claim. Then Jake called on Friday afternoon, his voice tight with panic. Sarah, we need an emergency board meeting. Now. What's wrong? David Chen is leaving. He just submitted his resignation, effective immediately. I felt my stomach drop. Why? He got an offer from Lockheed Martin, Senior Vice President of Strategic Operations, 40% salary increase, full relocation package. He's taking it. This was a disaster. David wasn't just our chief financial officer, he was our primary contact with the investor group that held 20% of the company. More critically, he was the person who had been managing all of our non-logistics operations, while I focused on supply chain and vendor relations. The board meeting that afternoon was grim. Jake looked like he hadn't slept. Marcus was pacing frantically, and Colonel Morrison was studying financial projections with a worried expression. The Pentagon decision comes down next week, Marcus said. If we get the contract, we need operational leadership in place immediately. If we don't get it, we need to figure out how to restructure the company to survive without that revenue. What? About promoting someone internally? I suggested. There isn't anyone ready for that level of responsibility, Jake replied. David was handling investor relations, financial planning, HR coordination, and strategic partnerships. That's not something we can just redistribute among existing staff. Colonel Morrison looked up from the financial documents. There's another problem. The investor group specifically negotiated David's involvement as part of their equity agreement. If he's not with the company, they have the right to reevaluate their position. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning they can pull their funding if they're not confident in our leadership structure. I felt the walls closing in. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place, we were facing a potential collapse of the entire corporate structure. We need to find a replacement quickly, Marcus said. Someone with David's credentials and experience level. That's going to take months, Jake pointed out. Executive recruitment, interviews, reference checks, contract negotiations. We don't have months. Over the weekend, the situation got worse. Word of David's departure had somehow leaked to our competitors, and by Monday morning, 2 of our major vendors had called to confirm the stability of our partnership agreements. One potential client postponed a contract signing pending clarification of Henderson Defense Solutions' operational continuity. The business community is small, and news travels fast. Within days, our reputation shifted from rising defense contractor to company in transition, which in business terms means risky investment. Then came the call I'd been dreading. Mrs. Henderson? The voice was crisp, professional, and unfamiliar. This is Patricia Blackwood from Sterling Investment Group. We need to schedule a meeting to discuss some concerns about Henderson Defense Solutions' operational leadership. Sterling was the investor group that held 20% of our company. Patricia. Blackwood was their managing partner, and she was not known for social calls. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon, the same day we expected to hear from the Pentagon. Marcus, Jake, and I sat in our conference room, waiting for Patricia and her associate to arrive, each of us knowing that the next hour could determine whether Henderson Defense Solutions survived as a company. Patricia Blackwood was exactly what I'd expected, 60-something, impeccably dressed, with the kind of controlled intensity that comes from decades of evaluating risk and making decisions that affect millions of dollars. Her associate, Michael Chen, no relation to David, was younger but equally serious. Let's be direct, Patricia said without preamble. David Chen's departure raises significant concerns about operational stability. Our investment was predicated on specific leadership capabilities, and we need assurance that those capabilities remain in place. Marcus started to respond, but Patricia held up a hand. More specifically, we need to understand how a company that was built around David's financial and operational expertise plans to maintain that level of professional management. We have strong operational leadership in place, Jake said, gesturing toward me. Sarah has been managing our logistics and supply chain operations for 3 years, and she's now officially our Chief Operating Officer. Patricia's gaze shifted. to me with laser focus. Ms. Martinez-Henderson, what's your professional background? I had prepared for this question, but hearing it in this context made my throat tighten. I'm a veteran with 4 years of military logistics experience, and I've been managing Henderson Defense Solutions operational systems since the company's founding. Educational background? Bachelor's degree in business administration, military. Logistics training, and 3 years of hands-on experience scaling this company's operations. Patricia exchanged a glance with Michael. And before your involvement with Henderson Defense Solutions? Here it was, the question that cut to the heart of every professional insecurity I'd developed over the past 3 years. I left active duty when my first child was born and have been managing both family responsibilities and company operations since then. So, you've been out of the traditional workforce for approximately 6 years. I've been working in this company's operations for 3 years. Unofficially. Yes, but the work was the same regardless of the title. Patricia was taking notes, and I could see that my answers weren't satisfying her concerns. Ms. Martinez-Henderson, I'm sure your contributions have been valuable, but our investors need confidence in executive leadership that has proven track records in corporate environments. David Chen brought 15 years of Fortune 500 experience and an MBA from a top-tier program. And I bring direct experience building and managing the systems that this company actually runs on, but no formal executive experience, no track record of managing major corporate partnerships or investor relations. No demonstrated ability to scale operations beyond the relatively small scope of your current activities. I felt my carefully constructed professional confidence beginning to crumble. Everything Patricia was saying was technically accurate, even though it ignored the substance of my contributions. Marcus jumped in. Sarah has been essential to our success. The Pentagon presentation, which hasn't resulted in a contract award yet, Patricia interrupted. And even if it does, successfully managing a $47 million expansion requires proven executive capabilities. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Patricia systematically questioning every aspect of our leadership structure and operational capabilities. By the end, it was clear that Sterling Investment Group was seriously considering withdrawing their funding unless we could demonstrate appropriate executive leadership. After they left, the 3 of us sat in stunned silence. They're going to pull out, Jake said finally. Not necessarily, Marcus replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, they are, I said quietly, because Patricia Blackwood looked at me and saw exactly what everyone else sees, a mom who's been playing businesswoman, not a real executive. That's not true. It is true, Marcus. It doesn't matter how good I am at the actual work. It doesn't matter that I built the systems that make this company run. What matters is that I don't fit their image of what a senior executive looks like. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and felt my heart stop. The Pentagon decision is in, I said. They want to schedule a call in 1 hour. 1 hour to find out if we'd won the contract that could make Henderson Defense Solutions a major player in defense contracting. 1 hour before we learned whether my fight for recognition had been worth destroying the financial stability of the company I'd helped build. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a cold voice was whispering that maybe Marcus had been right all along. Maybe there were some battles that couldn't be won, no matter how qualified you were or how hard you fought. Maybe some doors would always remain closed, regardless of who was knocking. Part 8. Breakthrough Victory and New Reality, the hour before. The Pentagon call felt like the longest 60 minutes of my life. Marcus paced the conference room, Jake stared at his phone, and I sat perfectly still, trying to control the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm me. Everything we'd worked for, everything I'd fought for, came down to this single phone call. At exactly 3 p.m., my phone rang. General Patricia Morrison's voice was crisp and professional. Ms. Martinez-Henderson, I'm calling to inform you that. Henderson Defense Solutions has been selected for the Special Operations Command Tactical Equipment contract. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. Marcus stopped pacing, his eyes wide. Jake's mouth fell open. The selection committee was particularly impressed with your operational frameworks and scalability plans, General Morrison continued. Your presentation demonstrated exactly the kind of sophisticated logistics management we need for this contract. Thank you, General. We're honored by your confidence in our capabilities. There is one condition, however. The contract requires designated operational leadership with proven capability to manage the expanded production schedule. Based on our evaluation, we're requiring that you personally oversee the operational implementation. I felt my heart stop. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? The Pentagon is requiring your direct involvement as operational lead for this contract. Your logistics expertise was the deciding factor in our selection. After the call ended, the three of us sat in stunned silence. We'd won the contract, but the Pentagon had essentially mandated that I be the person managing its implementation. They weren't just accepting my professional capabilities, they were requiring them. Marcus was the first to speak. They specifically requested you. They did. Not Colonel Morrison, not some outside hire with fancy credentials. You. Yes. Jake was grinning now. Sarah, do you understand what this means? The Pentagon just validated everything you've been saying about your qualifications. The victory felt surreal, but it was about to get even more surreal. Within an hour of the Pentagon announcement, my phone started ringing. The first call was from Patricia Blackwood. Ms. Martinez-Henderson, congratulations on the contract award. I've just spoken with General Morrison, who specifically mentioned your operational leadership as a key factor in the selection. Thank you. Sterling Investment Group would like to schedule another meeting to discuss expanding our partnership with Henderson Defense Solutions. Clearly, we may have underestimated the strength of your executive capabilities. The second call was from a reporter with Defense Industry Weekly, wanting to interview the operational mastermind behind Henderson Defense Solutions' Pentagon contract win. The third call was from a headhunter, asking if I'd be interested in discussing COO positions with other defense contractors. By the end of the week, I had received 12 interview requests, 6 job offers, and 3 invitations to speak at defense industry conferences. The same credentials that had been questioned just days earlier were now being celebrated across the industry. But the most satisfying moment came during our next board meeting, when we were discussing the operational expansion required by the Pentagon contract. We're going to need additional executive leadership, Jake pointed out. The contract requires us to triple our staff and establish operations in 2 additional states. I've been thinking about that, I said. I'd like to recommend someone for our new Vice President of Strategic Development position. Who did you have in mind? Marcus asked. David Chen. The room went quiet. David? But he left for Lockheed Martin, Jake said. I called him yesterday. Turns out his new position isn't what he expected, and he's not particularly happy. When I told him about the Pentagon contract and our expansion plans, he was very interested in discussing a return. What would it take to get him back? Senior Vice President title, 20% salary increase over his Lockheed position, and 3% additional equity stake. Marcus looked at the numbers I'd prepared. That's expensive. It's also exactly what we need. David knows our systems. He has the investor relationships we need to maintain, and he's already familiar with our operational structure. Plus, he's learned some things at Lockheed that could be valuable for our expansion. And he's willing to work under your operational leadership? Jake asked. I smiled. He actually seemed excited about it. Apparently, his presentation of our Pentagon proposal to the Lockheed executive team made quite an impression. They were very curious about where those logistics frameworks came from. 2 weeks later, David Chen was back at Henderson Defense Solutions, this time reporting to me rather than the other way around. During his first day back, he stopped by my office. "Sarah, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not seeing your capabilities clearly the first time around. Working at Lockheed gave me perspective on just how sophisticated our operational systems really are. Most companies would kill for the logistics infrastructure you built." "Thank you, David. I'm glad to have you back on the team." "I'm glad to be back. And I'm glad to be working for someone who actually understands operations from the ground up." The Pentagon contract transformed Henderson Defense Solutions from a small family business into a major defense contractor almost overnight. Within 6 months, we had grown from 12 employees to 47, opened offices in Colorado and Virginia, and were managing supply chains across 3 continents. More importantly, it transformed how I saw myself and how others saw me. I was no longer Marcus Henderson's helpful wife who sometimes worked on company projects. I was Sarah Martinez-Henderson, Chief Operating Officer of a multi-million-dollar defense contractor with a reputation in the industry that was entirely my own. The personal transformation was just as significant. Marcus and I had to completely renegotiate our relationship, both professionally and personally. It wasn't always easy. There were times when he struggled with my new visibility and independence, times when I had to resist the old patterns of deferring to his judgment. But we worked through it, partly because we loved each other, and partly because we both finally understood that my professional success wasn't a threat to our marriage. It was an asset to our family. 6 months after the Pentagon contract award, I was invited to speak at the National Association of Women Business Owners Annual Conference. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of successful female entrepreneurs, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. 3 years ago, I told them, my husband told me I was just a mom when I suggested I could help with his business presentation. Last month, the Pentagon specifically requested my involvement in managing a $47 million defense contract. The audience laughed, but I continued with a more serious message. The difference wasn't in my capabilities. Those had been there all along. The difference was in my willingness to fight for recognition of those capabilities, even when it meant risking everything I thought I wanted to protect. I paused, thinking about all the women in that audience who might be struggling with similar challenges. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to our professional success isn't external discrimination, it's our own acceptance of being undervalued. We tell ourselves we're being team players, or supportive partners, or putting family first. But what we're really doing is teaching others that our contributions don't deserve recognition. After my speech, dozens of women approached me with their own stories of invisible labor, unacknowledged expertise, and the struggle to claim professional space in businesses they'd helped build. I realized that my experience wasn't unique. It was epidemic. That's when I decided to start sharing my story more widely, to help other women recognize their own value and fight for the recognition they deserve. Because here's what I learned. Competence without confidence gets you nowhere. Expertise without advocacy gets you nothing. And no one is going to hand you the recognition you deserve. You have to be willing to demand it, document it, and if necessary, fight for it. Today, Henderson Defense Solutions is one of the fastest-growing defense contractors in the Southwest. We employ over 200 people, manage contracts worth more than $150 million annually, and have been recognized by the Department of Defense for operational excellence 3 years running. And yes, my husband still introduces me at industry events. But now he says, "This is Sarah Martinez-Henderson, our Chief Operating Officer and the operational genius behind our success." It took a corporate coup to get there, but sometimes revolution is the only path to recognition. If my story resonated with you, if you're fighting your own battle for professional recognition, or if you know someone who needs to hear that their contributions matter, I'd love to have you subscribe to my channel. I share stories like this one every week. Stories about women who refused to stay invisible, who fought for their place at the table, and who transformed not just their own lives, but entire industries in the process. Hit that subscribe button, and let's build a community of women who refuse to be underestimated, because we're not just anything. We're exactly who we've always been. We're just finally ready to prove it.